Zack Polanski, who's a Green Party London Assembly member. Good morning, Zack. Are these trials a good plan then?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show, as always. I think they're a brilliant plan. I think universal basic income is a time or an idea whose time has come. And we don't just need pilots. We need it fully rolled out. But this pilot will be a great way of collecting evidence that will demonstrate to the rest of the country and the rest of the UK that actually universal basic income is really good for dealing with poverty, with dealing with health inequality, and all sorts of other problems too.
There's a real buzz about it now. It's something that more and more people are talking about and thinking about. But can you, for those who are not familiar, can you just explain the principle of UBI?
Yeah, it's the most simple principle in the world, actually, which is just everybody receives a set amount of money into their bank account per month, guaranteed, that's unconditional. So this doesn't matter if you're rich, if you're poor, if you're employed or you're unemployed, you will always get this amount of money. And that amount of money is basic, as the term suggests. And that's to cover things like shelter, food, education, just some of the most basic things.
And what's the point of it? I mean, why do that? Why give money to people who don't need it, who might be extremely rich? What's the benefit?
And what the point of it is a brilliant question, because the point of it is partly to reduce inequality, to deal with poverty. The point about the rich and poor thing is, rather than a stigma which is attached to universal credit at the moment, rather than it being something, that some people have to beg for or ask for, or even, it's a routine that they have to go for, actually we get rid of all of those administrative costs, which actually cost a fortune in universal credit. And instead we say everyone can have this money. And sure, if you're rich and above a tax line, that's going to come back in tax anyway. But what you're doing is making a much more efficient system. One thing that really concerns me about universal credit right now is how dehumanizing it is, both for the claimant, but actually for the person whose job it is to look someone in the eyes, or on the phone at the moment, which is even more dehumanizing, and refuse them money or sanction them. And we could get rid of that whole kind of system and instead have a system that values people, that gives them dignity and respect, and has consistency to it too.
And you make it sound very simple, but surely it would become more complicated. You say everybody gets the same, but what if you've got a big family with lots of children? Do the children all get it as well? And do they get the same whether they're a baby or a teenager? And what if you've got big housing costs? You can't pay your mortgage. Do you get housing benefit, or are you expected to pay for this out of your universal basic income? I mean, surely it's going to end up just like being a benefit system.
Your challenge is really fair, Clive. So I'm giving you the headlines, which, at its heart is a very simple idea. I'm not an economist, but there's lots of people who've worked on this who are expert economists, and there's pilots going on all over the world. And when you get to the detail, it does get more complicated. But actually, there's still some simple principles that I can talk you through. So children would get a universal basic income. It would be smaller than an adult one, but again, not complicated. It's just something that's added into that bank account for people who are under 18s. There's a fantastic part here about emancipation, particularly with women's rights. When they've done these trials in other countries, they've found that when the money goes to a woman's account, if they're suffering domestic abuse, for instance, or in a relationship that they just don't want to be in, there's a lot more freedom there for them to be able to get away. Obviously, that's the same for men, but the trend at the moment is much more likely to be a woman suffering from that. In terms of disability benefits, that's one of the benefits, and I would suggest would probably stay. So that would be in addition to your universal basic income. But other than those very small exceptions, again, it's pretty simple in terms of it's a guaranteed amount of money per month.
And one of the criticisms is that you're giving this money, there's no guarantee that it will be spent in the right way. Sian Berry, for example, the Conservative mayoral candidate, said people might just spend it all on loads of drugs.
So Sian and I sit on the London Assembly together, and he says all sorts of things about people's character. And I think that poverty ultimately is not a lack of character, it's a lack of money. So if people don't have money, it doesn't necessarily mean if you give them money, they're just going to go straight and pay it on what we call the bads or the temptations. Actually, research suggests that when people have money and they have more of that mental well-being or health and well-being that comes with having security of a basic income, they're much more likely to spend it on education, on improving themselves, on setting up businesses. So actually, rather than fund alcoholics or drug users, this looks much more at how to prevent that. Also, it's a side note and something we've talked about before, but I think we need to look at drug use and alcoholism as a public health approach anyway, and certainly not something we should be punishing by law.
But could it be seen as a disincentive to work? That if you're just being given all that you need to get by anyway, then won't a lot of people think, oh, fine, thanks very much, I'm going to take my 250 quid and I'm going to sit and watch the telly all week?
Yeah, I think we underestimate the characters of people. I think that people ultimately want to get on and do things and they want to be productive. Again, your question is fair enough, though. If people don't want to do that, then what this is doing is giving them that basic income that means that they will just survive. But actually, we know that people aspire to do more. And all this means is that people have an incentive to work, but they'll be doing jobs that they want to be doing. They'll be doing jobs that enrich them and that they value. And also, quite crucially, things like unpaid care work that's happening right now. People could be doing that and not kind of struggling to survive. Artists, musicians, there's much more of an avenue there where they don't need to pay jobs, do jobs that they don't want just to pay the rent. And also, this one is obviously close to my heart, but political activism. So often it requires people to have a bit of funds behind them before they can even think about running for parliament or an assembly or as a councillor. Whereas actually this would give people the freedom to be able to do some of the things that they wanted to do and just know that they didn't have to worry about the rent or putting food on the table.
Do you think that it might be an inevitability? A lot of people are saying this is going to happen one day because there's going to be more unemployment, there's going to be more automation, and there's just not going to be enough jobs. So we've got to find a way to keep people going.
I think we need to look very carefully what happens after a crisis. And we know that in the 1940s, Nye Bevan responded with the NHS. So that was a great response, a universal healthcare system in response to a world war. But we can also look at what happened in the 1930s. We didn't go in that direction. In fact, looking across Europe, we saw the rise of fascism and the rise of, blaming people and scapegoating people. We are at a moment now where we're coming out of the crisis and we need to demand better, we need to recover better, and we need a good green recovery. Universal basic income would be one way of absolutely transforming our society. I think we can't be complacent about it, though. We need to be very worried about what this government might have in store next. And I think this is an idea that can have an inevitability to it in terms of when people discuss it and they look into the detail, they're largely in favour of it. It's got experts. And crucially, it's an idea that's coming from the left wing and the right wing in various different ways. So actually, there is cross-party consensus in this. It's been a Green Party flagship policy for a long time. And I'm really proud that it does feel like an idea whose time has come.
I suppose the big question, though, is, and no doubt you'll tell me that the sums do add up and the economists have looked at it, but it's how much it all costs. If you give everybody benefits, do you save enough in terms of organisation and bureaucracy that the bills are low, or actually would it cost so many tens of billions of pounds that it wouldn't be worth doing?
So it's partly a hypothetical question because it depends how much you're giving people, but I'll still take it head. You are not saving enough just by scrapping administration. I think that's unrealistic, that just scrapping that is enough to pay the universal basic income. So you do need to look at another income stream. And I naturally think that a carbon tax would be a fantastic way of funding this. For anyone who's not heard of the carbon tax idea before, again, it's quite a simple idea. This is just to encourage people to pay more or make people pay more who use fossil fuels for companies that are polluting. So this is the idea that the polluter pays. Now, this doesn't necessarily go to the consumer. It's not about punishing people, who live in households who are just getting by. This is a slow tax on those emissions. So what you're essentially saying to corporate companies and big companies and industry is you need to change your ways and you need to find ways to be better for the environment. So then what we're doing is we're cleaning up our environment and we're also finding a way to fund universal basic income so we can eliminate poverty.
This particular trial or trials in these Welsh villages, they've I don't know how they come up with it, but they've come up with £213.59 per week. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, again, it really depends on what model that you use. I prefer that it's more, and I prefer that we look at other ways of funding that income stream. If I'm honest, I'm not au fait with the Welsh government and their finances and how they're doing that exactly. I know in London, for instance, one thing that my colleague on the Assembly, Sian Berry, and co-leader of the Green Party, has put forward is the idea of a Creative Autonomy Allowance. That would be looking at £1,000 a month. And that's specifically for musicians and artists initially, just as a pilot. I know in Wales, they're particularly looking at focusing on people who are leaving care, young adults. So I think those are some interesting groups to focus on. But it is important to point out that a universal basic income, the idea is that this is for everyone and not just for, small groups. These are just because these are trials at the moment and you've got to find a group to begin with, so to speak.
Zack, thank you. Zack Polanski there, Green Party London Assembly member, outlining really why he supports UBI, Universal Basic Income.